Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement de droits de la personne à l'Université d'Ottawa. My name is John Packer. I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. C'est mon grand plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir quelqu'un qui est déjà très connu, surtout dans le domaine de ceux qui suivent la situation en Chine. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is extremely well known for those who are following situation in China and relating to China as the principal reporter on China for the news line Axios. Information source Axios. Most of us have read a lot of her words. And in fact, I understand just before she joined us, she made her most recent submission. So I don't know when that's online, but we'll see it imminently. Thank you for those who have come today to hear her speak about her book and those who are online. Let me just say that this session is being recorded. And we will take questions from those who are in the room later in the afternoon. Allow me to say a few words about first of all, the topic. It's extremely current. I don't need to say that. Coinciding when you plan these things, you're not sure what happens sometime out. And Ms. Allen-Ebrahimian has come a long way to join us. So we don't know if this is going to be in or out of the news. We kind of suspected it would be in the news, and I think it's very much in the news at the moment. For those, I think I don't have to say that today itself is important with a senior member of the Canadian Parliament opposition, Michael Chong, providing his testimony in Congress just hours ago. And in the last days, finally, the appointment by the government of Canada of the announcement of an inquiry. In fact, the person to lead it, High Court Justice from Quebec, to lead inquiry into foreign interference in elections and broader than that, for which many of us are happy to know it will be broader than that. But also coinciding in the last few days with the startling, if not surprising, arrest of a political advisor in London, with the remarks from out of Australia and New Zealand that they expect, suspect, and are confident that there are similar infiltrations. I think we should all be acutely attentive and concerned about what is happening in terms of the integrity and security of our sovereign states, our societies, our democracies, and much beyond. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, I mentioned, is a China reporter for Axios. She's also an award-winning journalist. She's for her work, her previous work, she's received the Robert Lewis Watchdog Award, which is a top prize given annually by the Society of Professional Journalists of DC Dateline Awards. So we know that she comes with the highest of honors, and we also know that her reporting is impeccable, precise, and entirely reliable. I have that personal experience because I came to know Ms. Allen-Ebrahimian, I guess 2 years ago now, or roughly, in the context of work that I was advising upon into the question of whether there is a genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or I guess otherwise said in Eastern Turkestan. And our conclusion is that there is, and it is ongoing. And we said that on the basis of very substantial evidence, scrutinized, provided by scholars, abundant evidence, much of it coming from the Chinese state itself, analyzed by area specialists, legal specialists, data specialists, and others. And we assess this on the basis of specifically the application of the United Nations 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Prosecution of Genocide. And in doing that, it was very important to have people who were not only close watchers, but had all of the means and attributes to analyze and assess with the rigor of a noted journalist, as is Ms. Allen-Ebrahimian. And it was in that context, particularly on the basis of some of the data she had herself brought to light, in particular, her work as a lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in the China Cables Project, which she had done before joining Axios, and then leading into that a whole lot of other important work and networks. So it is therefore, I think for us generally, and for me personally, a great pleasure now to have the opportunity to hear from Ms. Allen-Ebrahimian directly. She will speak for a good period of time, probably 40-45 minutes, about her book, China in the World, How Beijing, sorry, that's not the book, that's the name of our session, which is China in the World, How Beijing Rules at Home and Abroad. But her book on Beijing rules, which has just been published recently and also already getting spectacular reviews. She'll give some remarks about that, but not just the book itself, but more, I think, some of the elements. She has been challenged, I know already, on her choice of a subtitle, How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. She'll, I think, answer that, I hope. But she'll talk more broadly, particularly with elements which intersect our own concerns here in Canada these days. After she delivers her remarks, she'll be open for questions and answer in the room. We'll have a good period of time for that. So without further ado, thank you, Ms. Allen-Ebrahimian, for joining us. And you have the floor. She's just submitting her latest piece.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to come and speak with you all today. It's been such a pleasure to know John, at least via email and phone and Twitter, and I've quoted him in articles and relied on his expertise, and it's so wonderful to be able to meet him in person today, and to be here, especially right now at this really fascinating and concerning time in Canadian politics regarding China's political interference here. And that's a topic that the Chinese government's covert political interference in democracies and in the US has been a main focus of my investigative work for the past 6 years, and it's probably the main reason that I wrote this book. So I have a pretty lengthy presentation. I may shorten parts of it just in interest of time. See, there it is. That's my book, a shameless plug. If you don't have it, you can buy it on Amazon. Oops. Just let you read this quote here for a second. I chose to open my book with this and this presentation with this because for many years, I think beginning in the late 90s and up to the mid 2010s, if not just a few years ago, I think that China researchers, China specialists in the West really downplayed the importance of the party, of the Chinese Communist Party, of Leninist thinking, of its roots that have the similar roots as the Soviet Union, and especially the way that the Chinese Communist Party has worked so hard not to fall the way that the Soviet Communist Party did. And I think that this quote is so perfect because it demonstrates that Putin thinks, you know, that the Soviet Union's collapse was a failure, and that you can see that this is something that's very likely that we know that the party has chosen to learn from. The central concept of my book is authoritarian economic statecraft, and I'll go over this somewhat briefly. What I'm basically talking about here is China's economic coercion, but it's a broader concept than that. Economic coercion is a very useful term, but it refers to, you know, the stick, you know, harming people or threatening people. Economic statecraft is the use of a country's economy to accomplish broader geopolitical purposes, and it's generally shaping the environment. It can be positive, it can be negative, it can be, you know, carrots and sticks. And I use the word authoritarian very specifically in this phrase, authoritarian economic statecraft, to be very specific about what we're talking about here when it comes to the Chinese government. Every major country in the world has, you know, some degree of, you know, will employ some form of economic statecraft. And the US, of course, is the most notorious in this, or that, you know, our economic statecraft probably remains the most powerful in the world. And we do that through sanctions and other things. But the Chinese government's use of its economy to achieve goals beyond its own borders is specifically authoritarian, and that matters a lot. Let me just do a brief compare and contrast with Western economic statecraft in the modern era and what we're seeing from China. In the US case, our most famous form of economic statecraft is, of course, sanctions. And we're using our dominance of the international financial system to shape behavior of states and actors. And also there's multilateral sanctions through the EU or through with the EU or through the UN. US sanctions, as controversial as they sometimes are almost exclusively deployed in pursuit of agreed upon multilateral goals, even if the methods aren't always appreciated. So for example, you know, the US employs sanctions, will levy sanctions in order to pursue goals of nuclear nonproliferation, of punishing gross human rights violators, protecting the international financial system from abuse through money laundering, fighting bribery, and combating terrorist financing. There are some exceptions to that, but they are rare. There's, I would say, modern exceptions to that. And the exception, in a way, proves the rule. So one exception would be during the Trump administration, when then Secretary of State Pompeo announced that the US was going to sanction 2 international criminal court investigators because they were investigating potential US war crimes in Afghanistan. This was an obvious abuse of US sanctions power. And the Biden administration lifted those sanctions when Biden came into office. But that kind of thing is quite rare. Let's contrast that now with the way that China, the Chinese government, has come up with really innovative, I would say, ways of granting or denying access to its economy and its investments in order to shape behavior on the global stage. It does so exclusively, without exception, in pursuit of its own narrow geopolitical interests, and interests which are mostly of a clear illiberal or authoritarian nature. So, for example, the way we have seen access denied to China's economy in order to shut down discussion of the genocide in Xinjiang, in order to isolate Taiwan on the international stage. It is not an agreed upon multilateral goal that Taiwan should be isolated on the international stage. That is something that literally only Beijing wants. No one else actually cares about, no one else actually thinks that's a good idea. Other countries only go along with it because that's what Beijing wants. What else? Lots of quashing of dissent. The way that the Chinese government punished South Korea and even K-pop stars when South Korea allowed the U.S. to deploy. When South Korea deployed a U.S.-made missile defense system that Beijing did not like. So it's this pursuit of China's own illiberal core interests, so authoritarian economic statecraft. It's not, by no means is that China's only method of power projection beyond its borders. We also see, what else do I have up here? Of course, espionage, an extension of the global security state through transnational repression, diplomatic power, propaganda, censorship, growing military power. And then something I think that we need to be watching very closely is China's growing regulatory power and its legal power. For example, through its courts, the way that IP cases, the Chinese government is now kind of it's forcing foreign companies to bring their IP theft suits or patent suits, to Chinese courts, which is very beneficial for Chinese companies and Chinese economic and political power, and the Chinese government's legal power, and even their ideological power. Now, I don't think that the Chinese Communist Party has soft power amongst larger populaces in the way that democracies do, but they have a lot of soft power among autocrats. Lots of autocrats covet this kind of power. And I was just in Tanzania a couple of months ago where I visited a Chinese Communist Party built and funded training school that trains 6 different ruling parties in Tanzania and 5 neighboring countries. And these are all, they're multi-party democracies on paper, but they're really all one-party states because these ruling parties have all been in power for decades. And the Chinese Communist Party at that school sends party officials to train members of these African ruling parties in Leninism, specifically in party-state fusion and how to strengthen a one-party state. And these, members of these ruling parties think that's pretty great. So this kind of ideological power is growing, especially in regions of the world that have had a negative colonial experience with the West. I suppose all colonial experiences were negative. So places with a colonial history. Yeah, well, just one other point here is that China's authoritarian economic statecraft is an extension of China's, what some scholars are now calling China's party state capitalism, which is a kind of a tweak or an outgrowth of the concept of state capitalism. But it's the idea and the practice of the Chinese Communist Party having the ability and creating new and again creative and targeted control mechanisms over companies, over sectors of the economy, over trade, that it doesn't always deploy. This isn't a centrally planned economy, but it can do so at crucial moments to accomplish larger purposes. So that could be an economic purpose, to try to grow the economy in one way or the another for a certain strategic outcome, or it could be for a political purpose to punish, for example, punishing some major Chinese tech companies for not towing the line enough, or for just this kind of thing. So having a political and economic control, party state capitalism. This is the way that China controls access to its economy externally is through these same levers of power. Part two. So at this point, I have a lot of slides about my work on the Chinese government's covert political influence and interference operations in the United States. And I have a lengthy investigative chapter in my book about this. This is based on some reporting I did a few years ago, but this is more in depth. And it's an in-depth look at a really fascinating and very concerning case study. Some of you, it became very controversial in the U.S. So some of you may be familiar with it. I'm looking at here how China's Ministry of State Security, which is a government organ, it's China's intelligence and political security agency that operates both domestically and internationally, and how the Chinese Communist Party Bureau, known as the United Front Work Department, how they interact outside of China's borders to influence national and subnational politics. Not necessarily how they directly coordinate, but how they complement one another and how they make these kinds of operations possible and successful. This is Christine Fong, the woman there. She was a suspected Chinese intelligence operative. She was active from the years 2011, 2012 to 2015, starting out in Northern California, but then her actions spread nationally. But the Bay Area, San Francisco was her base. And you see here, she's taking photos. She's in photos with Eric Swalwell, now a prominent member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Mike Honda, who I can't remember if he was a senator or representative, I think a representative, and some other prominent local politicos in the San Francisco Bay Area. Fong had a twofold strategy in her work. It's a little bit hard to read. She had a long game of cultivating close ties with politicians at the local level, so mayors, city councilors, knowing that those, the local officials would one day rise up the system to become senators, cabinet officials, important bureaucrats, important lawmakers, important politicians. And this is, if you're an intelligence operative and you want to, have this, an asset network of, knowing or unknowing assets, what is truly espionage gold is if you can have a long and trusted relationship with someone from before they were important, from before they were famous, because they will trust you. If you've known them for 15 years, it would never cross their mind that you could possibly be operating on behalf of a foreign government. And this is what she was pursuing quite successfully, as we will see. Her other strategy was one of subnational engagement. This is a strategy that the Chinese government, I think, implements far more than any other government in the world. And if you look at the way that China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has government officials assigned to local regions in the U.S., across the U.S. This is, and they do that, in fact, across the world. It's really a huge effort on their part. And it's something that the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, only began paying attention to really around 2019 or 2020. It's a strategy. It's useful for several reasons. First of all, it's useful for its own sake. If it can be useful, if you have these connections with local U.S. officials. It can be great for Chinese companies that want to come in and they want to get the tender for the local shopping, to build the local shopping mall or to build the high-rise luxury apartments. It's great economically for Chinese economic actors. But more importantly, for our purposes, is a strategy known as, I think, how do I translate it? Using the local to surround the center. So, 以地方包围中央. And that means, trying to shape the policymaking environment, trying to shape the narrative environment from the outside in. So in the US federal system, if DC, for example, is becoming very hawkish on China, which it is, it's more or less impossible now for Chinese diplomats to get meetings, to have the kind of subtle influence that they used to have in Washington. But they can still do this on the state level. They can still do it even now, less so than before. But talking to governors, talking to state lawmakers, inviting mayors on delegations to China, and cultivating these friends. These are we're friends, aren't we? It's a friendly relationship. It's much easier on the local level because local officials are very unlikely to be well versed in foreign and national security issues, and the structure of the Chinese Communist Party, and in how Marxism Leninism works. I mean, name a mayor in the U.S. who understands Leninism. So this is a great strategy as central government policy becomes more and more hawkish on China. And this is exactly what we saw Christine Fong doing. She started out, and I go through this because it's really useful to understand how these institutions, many of them Asian diaspora or Chinese diaspora organizations, or clearly United Front organizations, they paved the way for her meteoric rise in local and even national politics. It was as though these United Front linked organizations that had been set up for years, they were the landing pad for her and the launching pad for her. And the way that she uses them, and I would say abuses them, is something that we have seen over and over again, replicated throughout every English-speaking democratic country that I have ever looked at for this issue. And it also shows, I think, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, I'll come back to it. So first of all, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, I know that's an issue that has been in the news in Canada in recent years, how CSSAs, which are Chinese Students and Scholars Associations on campuses, how they can surveil and harass other people on campus, or try to shut down free speech, or even communicate information to Chinese consulates and embassies secretly. A CSSA is how she got her start. So Fong kind of appeared out of nowhere in 2011 and enrolled at a fairly small Cal State Monterey Bay, Cal State University, outside of sort of on the periphery of San Francisco. And because it was a smaller university, because it wasn't prestigious, there wasn't already a CSSA there. She didn't have any competition. She essentially parachuted in, started a CSSA, and became the president. Clearly with the blessing and the support of the local Chinese consulate in San Francisco. And here I have I don't know, a letter of like thanks or something from the San Francisco consulate, and it's dated May 12th, 2012, there on the bottom. And it says, this is expressing gratitude for Christine Fong, her Chinese name is Fong Fong, for her work as the president, although they call actually chairman is the word they use, of the CSSA in Monterey Bay. She used that as her launching pad, and she did a great job. She was genuinely very, very good at it, and people liked her. So she spent the first year doing things like hosting basketball tournaments and beauty pageants and parties and stuff, and was really great at this. And she also founded in 2012 the local campus chapter of APAPA, which is the Asian American, oh dear, I'm going to get this wrong, Asian American Pacific Islander American Public Affairs Organization, which is a real organization. It's not a United Front linked organization. And it's with chapters across the US, and its goal is to help Asian Americans become more active in politics because they're a group in the US that have been historically underrepresented, both in literal like elected representation, but also just in like politicking in general. So she founded a campus chapter of that. And this is where we get her very first interactions with, let's see if I have a photo here, Eric Swalwell. I'll get to that photo in a bit. In October 2012, she invited Eric Swalwell to come to campus. He was not yet elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was just a local official at that time. The election was the next month, and he was successfully elected. I'll get to his significance in a bit. The university, in fact, even gave her like a Spirit Award because she was so good at this. And she began to invite many local politicians to come and give talks at the university. What's wrong with this? There's nothing in the world wrong with this. This is totally legitimate, behavior, activities. We want, wonderful like people to come, from abroad to come and do this kind of thing at our universities. However, what was she also doing? during this time, she was also having regular meetings with Zhang Weiwei, who was a Chinese Ministry of State Security official under diplomatic cover in the San Francisco consulate. And this, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but that is actually, that was, I think, the mistake that she made, or that the MSS made, agreeing to meet with him and meeting with him regularly, because that's how the FBI counterintelligence team actually eventually in 2014 found out about her, because they had a FISA warrant, a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant, to conduct surveillance on Zhang Weiwei. And they started noticing that this young, beautiful woman was meeting with him regularly. And they were like, and then they looked into her and then they freaked out. But more on that later. So 2012, between 2012 and 2014, Fong had this, again, meteoric rise. I spoke with more than 20 people who knew her personally, and they said that, by 2013, 2014, she was everywhere. And even though she was a student, she was in her late 20s and early 30s. She was a non-traditional student. And she very quickly branched off into off-campus politics, and she would use her APAPA affiliation to be like, oh yes, I'm with APAPA. And that was her real foundation. That was her real currency starting out with. She was clearly brilliant, and she was a brilliant networker. She was very good at getting people to think that she was important. And she started volunteering with campaigns. She volunteered for Ro Khanna's his unsuccessful campaign in 2014. He was, I think, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2016. Might be getting those years wrong. In 2014, she bundled campaign donations for Eric Swalwell's re-election campaign. I don't know if bundling happens in Canada, but in the US, what it means is that you have a person who isn't necessarily donating themselves, but what they do is they draw on their network of people to get those people to donate to a candidate. And so because of this, power to get lots of donations, and they have a lot of influence with that person. So she was doing that for Eric Swalwell in his re-election campaign. And she was very close to his office, and she was very close to him. Extremely close to him. She was sleeping with him. She positioned herself to be the connector between the Asian American community and members of Congress. This is key. This is United Front behavior. This is what many United Front linked organizations do. They come into communities, or I won't go into how local organizations can be co-opted, but essentially, community-based organizations that are affiliated with the United Front present themselves and become the mouthpiece or the representatives of the Chinese diaspora in that community, both to their elected representatives, saying, we represent the Chinese community and we want to tell you that you need to have a nicer relationship with Beijing. And then they also are the intermediary coming the other way. If someone like Judy Chu, also a House representative, wants to meet with her local Asian American or Chinese American constituents, she might reach out to them because they have this organizing power. This is totally illegitimate. They're not the true representatives, but this is how United Front representatives operate. And it gives the Chinese government a lot of illegitimate power in democratic societies. And it also marginalizes the voices, the genuine voices of our very valued Chinese diaspora communities. This is Raj, so I'll skip that. Some more photos. So this is Christine Fong. The person to her right there is Ro Khanna. At this time, he was not in Congress, but he is now. And there she is with Judy Chu, who was in Congress at the time and is still. And this is so bundling for the 2014 Swalwell campaign. Lots of photos of her and Swalwell together and other activities. Sister cities and mayors. This is so I'm going to go through another, so the next level and how she really branched out nationally across the US was when she started interning at a mayor's office, the local Fremont City mayor. Fremont City is the city where the university she was at was located. And while she was an intern at the office, she was instrumental in helping found a friendship city relationship between the Fremont City and a Chinese city. From that foundation point, from that platform, she used that as a platform to start attending mayors' conferences around the United States. There's two the Conference of U.S. Mayors meets twice every year. And then there's also the U.S.-China Sister Cities Mayors Summits, and she would go to these. And she also started during this time flying around the US and starting sexual relationships with US mayors. Lots of US mayors, between 10 and 15 of them. She was very busy. And as you can imagine, when the FBI did manage to get a FISA warrant on her and really began to trace what she was doing, this like scared the crap out of them, because there's really only one explanation for this, is in that basically she's running a very extensive and wide-ranging honeypot operation here. There's no other reason that someone young and beautiful will be flying around the US starting sexual relationships with mostly older men, much older. And there's even there's even a I want to say this is being recorded. It's fine. There's even a recording somewhere in the bowels of the US like security state of her in a car with a US mayor. And the mayor is like, I just don't understand why you like me, why you want to spend time with me. She was giving him a blowjob, and I didn't realize it's going to be like rated R. Sorry. And she said, oh, I just want to practice my English. So, but like seriously though, what an incredible abuse of sister city relationships on the part of the Chinese government. So just a brief history of sister cities programs. They were started in 1956 by President Reagan, the early years of the Cold War. And he really wanted to establish a program with people-to-people ties between democratic countries and countries behind the Soviet bloc. Just got some quotes here from him. You can read them yourself. But he founded Sister Cities International in order to get the governments out of the way, to get human beings together in a room, just them, so that students and local government officials and professors and business people can just get together and be human beings together and get to know each other, so that these two populaces don't hate each other for no reason. And that's how Sister Cities International was formed. And in the US and in like Germany, and I don't know specifically in Canada, but presumably in Canada, these Sister Cities programs are not conducted or organized by the central government. They're done purely at the local level, and they're not political. They are, they like help organize like high school student homestays, and they do, they'll have visiting delegations to each other's countries where they go on shopping trips and go see the Great Wall of China or go see the Statue of Liberty, whatever, like nice, really nice things like that on the US side. But on the Chinese side, it's not like that. Who runs China's Sister Cities program? And to be clear, there's over 1,000 sister city, friendship city, sister province programs that China has with, I think, like more than 100 countries. And those are all run centrally, ultimately centrally, by the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, a very easy acronym, CPAFFC, which is a government organization that is directed directly by the United Front Work Department. And this is an example of what we have, asymmetric kind of engagement. It's not even the right word, but sort of asymmetric engagement, where on the US side, you have these like, and I've interviewed plenty of US mayors and other officials who are engaged in Sister Cities programs. And man, they're just like the best people. I just love local government. Like they're just, so engaged and so genuine and so not politicized. And so they think that they're getting genuine engagement with the Chinese side. And on the Chinese side, I think there's plenty of government officials who wish that. But especially since Xi Jinping, the United Front Work Department has been much more proactive in politicizing these relationships and abusing them. Although to be clear, they've always abused them. I found an example, for example, from the late 1980s in Southern California, when there was a sister city. Well, there was a city, I think it might have been San Diego, but something down there that had sister city relationships with like a number of cities in a number of different countries. And they had like a high school sports competition for, lots of visiting high school students. It was really cool. And they had flags of all the countries. Okay, so what's the deal? The deal was they had a Chinese sister city and they had a Taiwanese sister city. Dun, dun, dun. And so they had the Taiwanese flag. And so I think a group of like six or eight Chinese diplomats from the LA consulate drove all the way down, arrived at the high school, made a huge fuss, forced them to take down the Taiwanese flag. This was like 1988. And after that, ever since then, that school, when they had this event, they only have city flags anymore. They don't do country flags because of that. So this has always been a potential tool for abuse, for political abuse, but Christine Fong's use of it for intelligence activities was a really dramatic one. So it got worse after 2012, though. And just the rhetoric we saw from it, the examples I uncovered of how they were directly promoting the BRI through the sister city relationships, which is inappropriate, and which their democratic counterparts experience as being inappropriate and not normal. A really obvious thing was when, I think it was 2020, when Lin Songtian, if you were following Wolf Warrior Twitter from like the early days, you would know Ling Songtian. I think he was the ambassador in South Africa. He was a very early, he was like a Wolf Warrior, like almost as early as Zhao Lijian. He became the head of the CPAFFC in, I think, 2020. So he was made the head of all sister cities, Chinese sister cities in the world. So some takeaways from what we see from Christine Fong. Oh, let me just say some clarifying things about Swalwell. First of all, there's no evidence that he knew. So he was not married at the time. You know, it's perfectly fine for him to date and do what he wishes. And there's no evidence that he knew that she was a Chinese government operative. And so what happened was, and why her operation was so nearly successful, I mean, I think it was successful in other ways, but why it was so very dangerous was that he was a rising member of the U.S. House of Representatives, elected in 2012, and reelected in 2014. And in early 2015, he was poised to be chosen to join the U.S. House Intelligence Oversight Committee, and he was going to be the head of the subcommittee on CIA oversight at the House. And the members of those committees have access to top classified information, and it goes through their offices. And she was in a close relationship with him up until on the eve of his appointment. The Department of Justice was looking into this, realized what was happening, gave him a defensive briefing, which is where they go in and then they sit him down and they say, hey, look, there's this thing happening. And he was like, I can't imagine the panic in his office on that day. And he immediately cut ties with her. In the US, this has been heavily politicized, and the Republicans eventually kicked him off the House Intelligence Committee, accusing him of being like a Chinese foreign agent or something. There's no evidence that he was that. And in fact, there was a sweeping counterintelligence investigation into Christine Fong. And I think that if he had done something wrong, besides having fairly bad judgment, that they would have found it, just to be super clear. I talked about the ready-made landing pad of United Front Work Department organizations. We see that with police. A later example, and I think one that's gotten lots of press coverage, which is very good, is the overseas Chinese police stations. I know that Montreal was listed as having several, and perhaps other cities in Canada. Exact same situation. So with these overseas Chinese police stations, how they were set up, they are all set up around 2017 or so. And the people who run them are almost always the people who were already the leaders of the local United Front Work Department organizations, like the National Association for the Peaceful Unification of China, these UFWD outposts. I visited an overseas Chinese police center in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, when I was there in July, and interviewed the head of, I have no idea why he spoke to me, but I have a recording of it. The head of the Overseas Chinese Help Center, which is what they're called. He was also himself the head of the local National Peaceful Unification Society in Dar es Salaam. He was also the head of the China-Tanzania Chamber of Commerce. And not only that, all three of these offices were in the same building, on the same hallway. They each had their own doors. So it's, the Venn diagram here is like a circle. And so that made it very easy for these overseas Chinese help centers to be set up. And what he told me was, I said, you set this up in 2017. Yeah. It's so interesting because there are like cities all around the world where everybody was like setting up all these overseas Chinese help centers in 2017. Was it like, did you guys like coordinate with each other? And he was like, no. We didn't coordinate. It just happened. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, definitely that was just a coincidence that all the heads of the the National Peaceful Unification Societies all decided in 2017 to set this kind of thing up. Oh, I didn't talk about dual function strategy. So where are we on time? We're fine, final time. Okay, great. The dual function strategy is a term that I use in my book to describe how the Chinese government approaches overseas Chinese community organizations. And I call in my book for the Chinese government to cease deploying dual function strategy, which of course they will not. But what it is kind of what I've already outlined for you. When there are these local Chinese community organizations that are real organizations, also sister city relationships, those are real things. They do real things. They do good things. It's great to have, visiting Chinese high school students. That's great. And that's a real thing that happens. And, all these organizations that either are what is it? The Tongzuhui, is that what it's called? These the unification associations, or the sort of the constellation of proxy organizations around them, they will do things like host children's Lunar New Year celebrations. That's great. That's fine. Those are real events. They'll have Chinese calligraphy classes on Saturdays, for kids. That's totally fabulous. Some of them help run, there's one in Maryland, they help run an elder care center for, elderly Chinese, many of whom moved to the US to take care of their, grandchildren. That's great. That's a real service. And sometimes when called upon, these organizations can also function as basically hidden mouthpieces for the Chinese Communist Party when they are required to. So, or when the people who run them personally desire for it to be that way. And so we see examples of this at CSSA. It's exactly the same thing, dual function strategy. So when, for example, Hu Jintao visited the US in 2010, or when Xi Jinping visited Florida in, I'm not even gonna remember the year, some year he visited Florida. Every time this happens, what you see is, or when he came to DC, what you see is the roads where he's going to be going through are lined with people holding these red signs, the Chinese characters being like, "Hi, we drove all the way here from Ohio. We're in Chinese, the Ohio China Business Council, and we definitely paid for that trip ourselves." And all these local organizations will come and hold signs, being like, "Yay, China! Yay, Xi Jinping! Yay!" And what happens is all the Uyghurs and all the Tibetans and everyone else who's the Falun Gong who want to protest the visit get crowded out. And it creates an appearance of, a sort of astroturf appearance of support for the regime, which is then sent back home, for look at all, Xi Jinping's support abroad. You can't run, you can't hide. Everybody loves him everywhere. And then in the US, it broadcasts to Chinese communities that if you secretly have pro-democracy thoughts about China, you're all by yourself. There's nowhere you can turn. Look at all these organizations who support Xi Jinping. And in some of my reporting, I spoke with people and they said, yeah, we got a call from the consulate asking us to come. They paid for our bus. They gave us boxed lunches. They gave us the flags. They gave us the T-shirts, all across the US for years. And in fact, all around the world. In 2008, if you remember the Olympic torch relay in 2008, which was, Beijing pushed, I think, to have to have the torch go through more cities than had ever been done in the history of the Olympics. Thinking it would be grand, and it was grand, but it also gave an opportunity for a lot of pro-Tibetan people to organize protests. And so what we saw in every major city all the cities where the torch went were major, every city where the torch went, there were also these huge pro-Beijing counter-protests. And at the time, not in Australia, John Garneau and Mackenzie did great reporting then, but in other places, like in California, for example, the reporting on this was, wow, look at these huge waves of support for the Chinese Communist Party. We had no idea that literally 1,000 Chinese students, came to support. We had no idea they loved they loved Hu Jintao this much or whatever. They loved Beijing this much. They loved the Chinese Communist Party this much. And one of the pieces that I've done looks at what was known, in fact, to intelligence agencies in 5 or 6 different countries at the time, is that this was in part organized by Ministry of State Security officials who were in the U.S. undercover, not diplomatic cover, but actually undercover. And so, the FBI, for example, knew that there were undercover MSS operatives on the ground in California directing these pro-Beijing crowds to go and block out to stand in front of the pro-Tibet protesters. Anyway, Dual function strategy, extremely harmful because among other reasons, it is highly polarizing in the target society. And I think this is something that Canada is seeing right now, because here's what it does. If you're a hawk, if you're concerned about Chinese Communist Party covert influence in your country, and you see this kind of thing, you see these like AstroTurf crowds, and you see these other things, you say, this is horrible. There are Chinese foreign agents everywhere. All of these Chinese calligraphy classes, it's just the CCP in disguise. That's communist calligraphy. You're all a bunch of communists. This is really extreme, like extreme rhetoric. It fosters that kind of rhetoric. And then on the other side, it can foster, among people who care deeply about the rights of immigrants, who care deeply about fighting racism. They say, there's nothing wrong with these organizations. You guys are totally crazy. This is just racism. This is just xenophobia. You're seeing the boogeyman. This is just like Cold War fear mongering. None of this is real. And that's not real either. Dual function strategy creates this kind of polarization and this total inability to talk to each other. Who's the victim of that? Who is the first and the last victim of that dynamic? It's the overseas Chinese communities themselves. They get caught in the middle, not only in between these two sides, but also they are the targets of Chinese government operations in the first place. And it just totally sucks for them. So what do we do about it? I outline a three-tiered approach in my book that's focused on preserving and restoring the civil rights of Chinese diaspora communities. Preserving means preserving them from an excess or an overexpansion of the security state. And I'm thinking, what we saw, for example, in the US after 9/11. We don't want that to happen to Asian diaspora communities and Chinese diaspora communities. So preserving their rights, but also restoring their rights. Because I think, as you've seen in Canada, as we've seen in the US, if you're trying to organize freely in a Chinese language environment or in a Chinese community in the US, or you're trying to have a Chinese language newspaper or anything like this, or even an on-campus event about Xinjiang, you can't, not really, because the Chinese police will come after your family, or someone is going to report you, or your business is going to be, your businesses in China are going to be like crushed. So there has been for actually a long time now a shrinking or a loss of the basic civil rights that other people enjoy, in host democratic societies, that Chinese diaspora communities do not enjoy. If they want to criticize Beijing in their own language, if they want to organize to do that, if they want to talk about democracy in China, they will face often heavy consequences, or 100% of them will face the risk of consequences. So what do we do? Number one is increase public awareness of the dual function strategy. So we can stop yelling at each other because we don't understand and be like, oh, there's this thing happening. That's why we all feel insane. It's this strategy that is in fact designed to polarize and to create like distrust within democratic societies. And second, I can't emphasize this enough, ask Chinese communities what they need to feel safe in their own communities. They definitely know. Ask them. And then third is offer extra attention and support to members of Chinese diaspora communities who are special focuses of pressure from Beijing, such as dissidents, political dissidents, religious refugees, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese. Sorry if I left out anybody, but that's the basic groups. Give them special attention and special focus. Here's an example, a specific example of what that might look like. Let's say universities, CSSAs. What I think universities in democratic societies should do, in the US, what they should do is have a clear written guideline in the student handbook that they talk about with their words every year, at the beginning of every year when they do new student orientation and any kind of opening year kind of event. Say, our university does not permit students to hand over private information about other students or faculty or visiting speakers to foreign governments. If you do that, you will be suspended. Why does that matter? Part of what we have seen for a long time is an imbalance in an incentive structure. From the Chinese government, there's intense carrots and sticks to act on behalf of the Chinese state. So carrots would be, if you're a CSSA president, back in I think it was 2016, and I forget which, it was maybe UC San Diego, a college in Southern California, invited the Dalai Lama to speak. And when this was announced, this local CSSA made a big protest out of it. They said, we don't want this. We don't want this. This hurts the feelings of the Chinese people. It's probably racist too. We don't want it. The Dalai Lama came anyway. But the local LA Chinese consulate invited the CSSA leadership into their consulate a few months later and gave them a special award for doing that. What is that special award good for? You can put it on your resume so you can get a job at a Chinese state-owned enterprise and make money when you get out of college. This kind of a carrot, if you will, and a stick. Increasingly, Chinese students on campus worry that if they don't do this, that they will face censure from the Chinese government. If they don't, they feel pressure to report. If they're asked to come in and report and they don't, they're worried that their families, their parents back in China might, be invited to tea by the local security bureau. But there's no counteracting pressure, no countervailing pressure on the other side to reward students or to say, look, here's a boundary you can't cross, to push back against that. So of course, many students on campus, either if they have pro-democracy feelings, they're quiet about it. Maybe they tear down, if they have nationalist feelings, they tear down posters for, like events about, I don't know, about COVID origins or something. It helps even very innately nationalist students. If you can at the university, you can say, this is against our government, this is against our university guidelines. What students can do is when they're called in or when they have a relationship with the Chinese consular officer, and that officer says, hey, can you tell me about, I saw this lecture, can you tell me what's happening? Can you go and film and send the film to me? Chinese students can say, no, I can't. Look, here's the student handbook. Here's a guideline. If I do this for you, I will get kicked out. Chinese consular officials will respond to that. They will understand that. And it also can help emphasize or create in Chinese students' minds that this is actually not acceptable in the United States. People have not really been conveying that to them. No one has been speaking up, for our civil rights and our civil society, saying, no, that's not how we act here. Please, we welcome you to learn values. Here's one of them. And it can help rebalance the incentive structure for Chinese students on campus. This kind of principle can be repeated in other aspects of society. Part 3, disinformation, Russian versus Chinese disinformation. So traditionally, what were the differences that we've seen? So disinformation being another way, of course, that authoritarian governments try to wield power beyond their own borders, narrative power, but also other kinds of power. Russia, its goals have been to destabilize the information environment and create kind of an information chaos, create confusion and uncertainty about what the truth actually is in target societies. And a great example of this is at the beginning, or throughout the pandemic, but at the beginning of the pandemic, when we saw Kremlin-backed media accounts being like the COVID, because it was echoing Chinese propaganda at this point. The pandemic originated in Ukraine from U.S. biolabs in Ukraine, but also other accounts would say, no, it originated, or not no, but no, the COVID pandemic originated when the U.S. military went to Wuhan. No. This lab in Maryland created the coronavirus. All these competing accounts, doesn't matter. We'll just have a bunch of different competing accounts and make everybody feel like truth is unknowable, creates like chaos and confusion in target societies. And methods. Oh yeah, multiple conflicting theories, the amplification of conspiracy websites, third-party sites, which are third-party sites without funding transparency, a coordinated use of diplomatic and embassy Twitter accounts and state-backed media to help boost the theories. This is Kremlin's MO. We saw exactly this in 2016 during the US presidential election. China, traditionally, has had a different approach to propaganda, or its online messaging strategy, or its general messaging strategy. So before 2019, its goal was to create a single immutable narrative that presents China as nothing to be scared of, just pursuing win-win cooperation, really your friend. And doesn't try to negatively impact target society. So we didn't see prior to 2019, we didn't see attempts to change the narratives within target societies on topics that didn't relate to China and the CCP. But there are some early counterexamples that I'll get into in a moment. And its methods was intense suppression of dissenting information domestically and increasingly abroad, and amplification of positive narratives about China and the CCP. And this is like the classic clunky CCP propaganda of like creating a community of common destiny for win-win cooperation under Xi Jinping thought era and the new, this like just totally clunky, like totally falls flat, at least in Western democratic societies, like not particularly effective, at least not directly. But some early counterexamples. So in 2014, this is a story that I wrote and reported in 2014 as it was happening. So earlier that year was when there was a knife attack in Kunming. There were some people that Chinese state media said were Uyghurs, that they were separatists. Somebody definitely came in and killed like 30 people. It was definitely some kind of like violent attack. And it was presented as a Uyghur terrorist attack, and it shocked a lot of Chinese people. People online called it like China's 9/11, whatever. Big, lived large in Chinese people's minds. So on the eve of June 4th in Hong Kong, which is where every year up until 2020, there was a big Tiananmen memorial vigil, candlelight vigil. On the eve of this candlelight vigil, there were some Chinese language Twitter accounts that were tweeting and amplifying each other with a screenshot of what they said was a media report from a Guangzhou media outlet saying that dangerous terrorists had just escaped from a prison in Guangdong and fled to Taiwan, and they're wearing all black, beware. The next evening, during the actual Tiananmen vigil in Hong Kong, there were again the same and other Chinese language Twitter accounts tweeting in Chinese saying, I'm at the vigil. I just saw this person in black. They're wearing a headband and they had a knife. It's so scary. Now, it was pretty small. We're talking dozens of accounts getting at most hundreds of likes. But I noticed that the handles of these accounts were all things like at James Ashley 7562 and like David Brittany 34100, like clearly bots, very clearly. So I wrote about this, and when I wrote about it, Twitter took them down. But this was 2014. This was years before, in fact, 5 years before Twitter and Facebook ever made their first public announcement of a China state-backed disinformation campaign on their platform. So it was happening. It was like experiments. Why is that different? That's covert. It's targeting a society outside of mainland China, and it's trying to disrupt that society and events that are happening on the ground. But anyway, that was a bit of an exception. 2019, 2020, we saw things changing. So we had the rise of foreign-facing online disinformation campaigns. And I just mentioned in the summer of 2019, in the middle of the Hong Kong pro-democracy anti-extradition treaty movement in Hong Kong, there was it was the first time ever that Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube revealed that there had been a China state-backed disinformation campaign happening on these platforms targeting people outside of China. Late 2019, early 2020, if you were paying attention, and there were also articles about this. Before that, there had been like a dozen Chinese diplomatic accounts on Twitter, and they were super boring. It was all like bumper crop in Tibet, kind of like really, really boring, like not effective Chinese propaganda. But in 2019 and early 2020 is when we had the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy online. So like Zhao Lijin became huge, and within a few months, there were more than 100 Chinese diplomatic Twitter accounts. And beginning in January 2020 is when we saw, I think, the first truly global application of this, China's first really big global big lie, that the coronavirus pandemic did not originate in China or in Wuhan. And what happened? Why did it change? I think, I suppose it is because the Chinese government looked at how effective the Kremlin had been in sowing chaos and distrust in the US through very, very low cost, like Facebook and Twitter operations. And they thought, maybe we'll try that for ourselves. So we had early propaganda. I'll skip through this, but just some early narratives. So China's response bought time to the rest of the world was a very early narrative. And the second one, the coronavirus may not have originated in China. And that's the one that the Chinese state took and ran. And so this is the Chinese embassy in South Africa. This is the dude. This is Lin Songtian, the guy who was running this embassy. He's the one who then became the head of the CPAFFC and the head of all of China's sister cities. So here's this, what's the date here? Do I have the date? It's like February. Although the epidemic first broke out in China, it did not necessarily mean that the virus is originated from China. Okay. And then another one, this is from the original wolf warrior Zhao Lijian, who later went on to like very strongly defend China's policies in Xinjiang. But it's ironic because if you knew him from when he was the ambassador in Pakistan or diplomat in Pakistan, he actually had a Muslim name. I think it was Muhammad. It was like, so his Twitter account was like Muhammad Li Jianzhao. And then later he was like, no, actually killing Muslims is fine. So this is another sort of disinformation. Look at the interactions there. 7,600 retweets. Really a lot of amplification happening there. This is also when we see Russian accounts and Chinese accounts starting to amplify each other. This is from Paul Moser. He's a New York Times reporter at the time. He was based in China, and he was just tweeting about his experience talking to real people on the ground. Okay, so we're seeing all this disinformation. We're seeing Chinese state media like amplifying this theory. We're seeing Chinese diplomats talking about it. What was the effect in China? And he says, it seems like half? Is that what he says? About half of Chinese like believe it. And he just said, what a weird thing where like literally everyone else in the world knows it started in Wuhan and like half of Chinese people think it started in the US. So the big lie becomes an online disinformation campaign. I just talked about that. Yeah, so coordinating with Russian-backed accounts, blah, blah, blah. Here's the thing I want to leave you with. This is kind of a what to watch. China's ambitions are now surpassing the Kremlin's by far. So this is a story from one of my favorite investigative reporters, Kate Cadell at the Washington Post. China harvests masses of data on foreign targets, documents show. So I'll just let you read through that. I'll give you a minute. Basically, she found hundreds of public tenders from public security bureaus and Ministry of State Security in China, where they are trying to create, based on China's own domestic information surveillance and control system, trying to recreate that infrastructure facing abroad using, advanced tools, AI and stuff, and mass data gathering tools, to not only immediately to be able to follow very clearly what's happening, like on Twitter and Facebook, but to get real-time alerts, like to people's cell phones. So like if, something goes viral on Twitter, like criticizing the Chinese government, or like, here's a new investigative story about like, something that's happening in Canada related to China, that various people in the Chinese state would get real-time alerts on their phone. What would they want that for? Why? It's clear. To try to then immediately deploy their various strategies, whether that's bots or state media or any kind of like online amplification campaign to try to drown it out, to try to discredit it. And in that way to extend China's online information control beyond its own borders. The Russian government can't do anything like this. It doesn't have the capacity. I think that is my last. Oh, this is my last one. This is from last month. Meta takes down the largest online influence network in history, Chinese state-backed. So the largest online influence network in history was a Chinese state-backed network that Meta announced about 2 weeks ago it had taken down. So we can see the trajectory of the Chinese government's ambitions. And that is my last slide.
So we have quite a bit of time still for some questions, which can be posed from the floor here.